Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Isabelle Hamdou. I am the Deputy Director of the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals and Metals and Sustainable Development, the IGF. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar on the role of critical minerals in the clean energy transitions, which is also the name of the latest issue of the IEA's World Energy Outlook report. The report is in the chat box. If you want to download it, it's there, or you can download it on their website. The IGF is very honored to co-host this event with the IEA. We are eager to support the dissemination of the outcomes of this groundbreaking report that unpacks the complex links between clean energy technologies and minerals, assesses the supply risks that may affect our commitments towards the energy transition, and more importantly, proposes solutions on what needs to be done. In a few minutes, you will hear more about the strategic importance and the timeliness of the report from Greg Radford, the director of the IGF, and from Pascal Lafont, the chief legal counsel of the IEA. Following their initial thoughts, the team that worked on the report will present the main highlights. Then Alec Crawford, IGF's lead on this theme, will host a conversation with our expert. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share the link to all people who have registered, and we will also share it on the social media for people who didn't manage to register or miss the conversation now. I look forward to hearing more from the panel and pass it on to you, Greg, for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabelle. I really appreciate the introduction, and welcome everybody to our webinar on behalf of the IGF. So for those that aren't familiar, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development is a global forum of 78 nations that are committed to leveraging mining for sustainable development. So the goal of the IGF is to improve resource governance and decision-making by governments working in the mining sector. So many IGF members are also members of the IEA. And so we're really pleased today to be able to co-host this webinar with IEA. We also, as Isabelle mentioned, this is a really important report. It has incredible amount of data and insights. And so we see this report as a really incredible and valuable research that helps better understand the role that critical minerals will play in a clean energy transition. The need is clear. A typical electric car, for example, requires 6 times the mineral inputs of a conventional car. Minerals such as lithium and cobalt may increase by nearly 500% by 2050 to meet the growing clean energy demand. So meeting the growing demand, has a lot of challenges and risks evolving risks that have to be managed. For example, there's a high geographical concentration of production of minerals such as cobalt. There's a long project development lead time in the mining sector, which can conflict with the need for shorter development times for transition to low carbon economy to help achieve the sustainable development goals and helping meet the Paris Agreement. We're going to see more remote mining assets, so moving into more remote areas, which will help, somewhat exacerbate kind of the growing scrutiny on environmental and social impacts that happen from these kind of mining activities. And there's also a need to share greater benefits with communities that are impacted from mining. We'll also see a higher exposure to climate risks, which is only going to increase over time. So we see this IEA report as being really valuable for our members who are increasingly thinking about these complex challenges, how they're going to impact the mining industry going forward, and equally important, what is the role of the government and how governments should respond to that. So the issue is only going to grow in importance. The transition to a low carbon economy is accelerating, and there's a need for us to get it right, and there's a need for us to act now. So thank you very much for joining today. And I'd like to hand the mic over to my colleague, Pascal Lafont, the Chief Legal Counsel at IEA, for his intro remarks. So Pascal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Isabelle and Greg, for the warm introduction and the kind words. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you all, and welcome to this workshop. I want to begin by thanking Greg and Isabel and the IGF team, Alec and David, for organizing this webinar. There is a growing body of evidence emphasizing the value of international cooperation in the area of minerals development. And we see IGF as probably the best advertisement I could think of for the value of this cooperation. The technical assistance and tools made available through IGF make a real difference for IGF countries, some of which, as you said, Greg, are also IEA members, but also to the broader community around the world. However, despite these important successes, there remain critical gaps in the area of international mineral coordination, particularly at the nexus between minerals development and energy security. As some of you may know, the IEA was created primarily as an energy security organization. Its DNA is about mutual assistance, guarantee the energy security of its members. And this concept is embedded in a binding international treaty. So what it means is that each IEA member has pledged assistance to the other. And this is the reason why we are often referred to as the NATO for energy. And my colleague Casey Michaels will expand on this a little later today. The security mechanisms organized under the IEA's treaty are designed to provide insurance against the risks of energy supply disruptions. The elements of energy security are shifting alongside changes in the energy sector. As we have detailed in the report that you will hear more about today, the demand for minerals needed for clean energy technologies are likely to skyrocket as countries pursue global climate goals. In turn, this means that the supply of minerals will be of ever increasing importance for energy security as well. This rising importance will require energy policymakers to expand their horizons and consider both potential new weaknesses and new solutions. This could include new efforts to mainstream higher environmental and social standards, manage supply chain resilience, facilitate investment in supply and support recycling. Now, and I'm sure this is the same with you, Greg and Isabel, I hear from some corners in the constituency that it is time for an OMEC, mirrored on the existing OPEC, where the M would replace the P for petroleum and M for mineral, an organization for mineral exporting countries. I hear from other corners in the constituency that it is an IMA International Mineral Agency that is needed, where mineral would replace the energy word in IEA, International Energy Agency. But both mineral and energy are linked. So let me put it to you today as a scene setter that, in my view, there is no need to replicate the past. On the contrary, let's try to learn from past lessons. Let's try to come together, producers, consumers. Let's avoid unnecessary polarization, potentially leading to confrontation, which would harm energy security, which is at the core of our action and in the best interest of all our stakeholders. International coordination would be vital as countries, companies, civil society come together to address these challenges in fora such as the IGF and the IEA. Now, you'll be hearing from Team IEA today, a talented team of lawyers, engineers, and policy analysts. And we hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation. We very much look forward to engaging with you all. And once again, Isabelle, Greg, thank you so much for hosting us today.
Thanks so much for those opening remarks. It's inspiring to hear where this space is going. I know that that excitement is really shared by a number of the IGF members, and they're really keen to learn more about the report. So with us today, we're going to split this essentially into two halves. The first half, we're going to have our IEA colleagues take you through some of the findings of the report. And in the second half, we'll have time for a Q&A with the lawyers and analysts on the IEA team. So without further ado, I think that I will pass over to Casey Michaels and Tae-Yoon Kim, who will take you through the findings of the latest IEA World Energy Outlook report. Casey, over to you.
Thank you, Alec, and also to Isabelle, Greg, and Pascal for the introduction. And thank you, of course, to all the participants who are joining this webinar today. Really excited to be here with you. We will try our best to make this session as interactive as we can. In addition to the kind of Q&A section at the end, we're also going to use a live polling feature. This is used through menti.com. So you will be asked at a few points in this presentation to answer some questions, and please, you can do this now. Go to menti.com on your phone or computer and enter the code here you see on the screen, and it will prompt you to answer the first question. In a moment, Tae-Yoon and I will walk you all through some of the key findings of our report. But before getting to that, we wanted to begin with a little bit more information and a bit of an introduction to the IEA for those among you that may not be as familiar with us as with other organizations. So for our first question, we'd really just like to understand a bit better what you all already know about us. So in that regard, the question is what exactly is, in your view, is the IEA most well known for as an energy security organization? For our scenario analysis, this includes some of our key reports, such as the World Energy Outlook, Energy Technology Perspectives, Energy Efficiency Market Report, et cetera. The policy analysis, we do government peer reviews, for example. As a provider of energy data and statistics, we provide monthly oil statistics. Or finally, as an international coordination platform for governments. So I'm starting to see some answers come in. Looks like there's a cluster around energy security organization, as well as timely energy data and statistics. So I'll just let these come in for a few moments. And I think maybe it was already clear from the nature of the question, it's a bit of a trick that in our view, we do all of these things. These are all very much within the realm of the kind of day-to-day activities that we do at the IEA. And so part of the reason we ask you this question is that we anticipate that some of you may have been wondering why the IEA is producing a report on minerals, given that we are an energy agency and our typical area is focused on electricity as well as fuels. And in fact, this is a relatively new area for us, and maybe it doesn't necessarily fit so well into your prior understanding of the IEA as an agency. So to expand on that just a little bit, the IEA, of course, does all the things listed on the previous slide. And as Pascal noted, as a historical matter, our founding treaty was negotiated in the wake of the 1970s energy crisis, primarily as a collective energy security mechanism. Under that treaty, our members have agreed to assist each other in times of energy supply disruption. This can include by releasing strategic stocks of oil and also by initiating demand restraint measures in the event of an oil security emergency, as well as carrying out periodic emergency response exercises to test the system. In addition, members have agreed to cooperate on a number of other issues, including cooperation and sharing of energy data, consulting with local and international industry players to ensure rapid response, as well as carrying out peer reviews of each other's national energy policies and legislation. Of course, since the 1970s, the concept of energy security has evolved quite significantly. Although strategic oil stocks remain an important part of our platform, our activities now encompass other areas, including gas security, electricity security, and as recently, in a very big way, clean energy transitions. And as the concept of energy security has evolved, so has the IEA's mandate. And this is why our member governments gave us a very clear mandate in past years to explore how the security of critical mineral supplies will impact clean energy transitions. And this report that we'll discuss today is a direct outgrowth of this shift. And in this report, we explore estimates for demand for critical minerals in clean energy transitions, an outlook for supply over time of these minerals, as well as exploring the implications for energy security, and also the need for sustainable and responsible development of minerals. And with that, I'll ask you to return to Minty and ask a second question, which you'll see here on the screen. And I will turn it over to Tae-Yoon Kim to walk you through the outlooks for demand, supply, and other key considerations.
Thanks, Casey. So we are asking questions about the countries with the net zero commitment, how much they account for in the total global GDP and emissions, and the answers are coming in. So it's quite split between 30% and 70%. And maybe I can give you an answer through my presentations. Yep. In 2020, despite of the pandemic, you have seen some growing momentum for clean energy transitions. Many countries and companies announced the pledges to reduce their emissions to net zero by mid-centuries. And the countries with those pledges account for some 70% of global GDP and emissions. And of course, these are yet pledges, but as they turn into actions, and it implies a massive acceleration in clean energy deployment. But a clean energy system is fundamentally different from the one fueled by hydrocarbons in a way that they need a lot of metals and minerals to build. For example, the lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and graphite are vital for batteries performance, and the rare earth elements are vital for the wind turbines and electric vehicle motors. And solar panels are not very mineral intensive, but the scale of capacity addition means plenty of additional demand for copper, silicon, and silver. And transmission and distribution lines, which are the backbone of our future power systems, requires huge amount of copper and aluminum. What this means is as we advance energy transitions and we are moving from a fuel-centric energy system toward a mineral-intensive energy system. For example, as Greg mentioned, the typical electric vehicles requires 6 times more mineral inputs than conventional cars. And the offshore wind requires 13 times more the mineral resources than the typical similar size gas-fired plant. And over the past decade, the amount of the minerals needed to add a new renewable capacity has increased by 50%. But in general, there's no shortage of mineral resources. But the question is, there's no guarantee that supplies will be available at an affordable prices when you need them. And this decarbonizing energy system calls for a new approach to energy security. And the supply of minerals are increasingly becoming an essential part of the energy security debate. And these challenges and issues are manageable, but requires the early attention from policymakers to avoid some damaging outcome for our planets. And the first question is how much do we need? How much could demand rise? And the short answer on the left chart is a concerted effort to achieve our global climate goals means some quadrupling of overall mineral requirement by 2040. And an even faster energy transition to hit the net zero emissions globally by 2050 requires even more the mineral requirement by 6 times. And this growth is mainly led by electric vehicles and battery storage, but also the transmission and distribution lines and also low carbon power generations. And we are talking about 4 to 6 times demand growth here, but some minerals, especially battery metals, shows much larger scale of growth. In our climate-driven scenario, the lithium sees the fastest growth by around 40 times. And graphite, cobalt, nickel also shows some 20 to 20 times demand growth. And there are some 2 important implications for this from this rising demand growth. The one is the the emergence of the clean energy technologies in total demand growth. Some 10 years ago, in 2010, so the share of clean energy technologies in total mineral demand is very minimal. But already in 2020, the lithium, the EV batteries, and energy storage became the largest consuming sector of lithium. And by 2040, they account for more than 90% of total lithium demand. And the similar trend are also visible for cobalt, nickel, copper, and rare earth element. And that means there are some strong linkages between clean energy technologies and the mineral markets. And the second implication is about the cost of clean energy technologies. We have seen the rapid reduction in the cost of clean energy technologies over the past decade due to some economies of scale and technology learnings. But the flip side of that is now the raw materials, including minerals and metals, account for larger share in total cost of clean energy technologies. And this trend are set to continue as we move forward energy transitions. And that means the changes in the mineral prices can have a major impact on the prices and cost for clean energy technologies, and in turn, the investment requirement for clean energy transitions. So the intricate mineral supply can make our energy transition either slower or more expensive, which is why the policymakers need to pay attention to these topics. Next slide, please. And there are some implications for companies that mine and process these minerals. Today, the revenue from coal production is 10 times larger than that from the energy transition minerals. But this picture is set to change rapidly in our climate-driven scenario as coal use goes into structural decline and the energy transitions gain a tailwind from rising demand and also upward pressure on the cost and prices. And by 2040, the combined revenue from energy transition minerals overtake that from coal production well before 2040, which has a major implication on the company's business portfolio and strategies. On the supply side, one of the key issues is the higher level of geographical concentration of productions. For mining, when we talk about geographical concentration, we mainly talk about oil and natural gas, the Middle Eastern countries for OPEC, but the level of concentration for minerals is much higher than that of oil or natural gas. In many cases, from cobalt, rare earth, lithium, the top 3 producing nations control well over the 75% of total global output. But it is not just about mining. When it comes to processing and refining operations, the level of concentration is even more visible with China's strong presence across the board, from copper, nickel, all the way to rare earths, as the country has invested heavily in the mineral supply chain to support the growth of its clean tech manufacturing industries. What is the issue of this geographical concentration, whether it's China or DRC or other countries? When you have a very high level of concentration in production in a single country, and when there are some physical disruptions or trade restrictions or other development happens in a major producing nations, and it can have a major impact on global supply and prices. This is why this level of concentration matters for consumers as well. Next, another question is whether the supplies will be in a position to meet the rising demand in a climate-driven scenario. For this, we compared the projected demand growth in a climate-driven scenario and also expected production from existing mines and production project under constructions. And the outlook, the result varies depending on the minerals you're talking about. But beyond the medium term, in most cases, the expected demand overtake that of the expected production. So we are seeing some looming mismatch between the strengthened climate ambitions and the supply of minerals. And these challenges are also compounded by the long lead times to develop new projects and also declining resource qualities. So there are some strong role for policymakers to give some strong signals for market saying that energy transition is going to happen. And that will reduce the uncertainties around demand and also the reduce investment risks and enable more investment in new mineral development. Next. Another question that we heard regularly during conducting this exercise is, because the minerals, especially energy transition minerals, are much more emission intensive than other bulk materials. And having said that, how clean are the clean energy technologies when we take into account emissions from mineral development? So we compare the life cycle emissions, the choices between buying on conventional car and electric vehicles, looking at their life cycle emissions. And the green and blue part is the emissions from the manufacturing process. And as you can see, for this green, the blue area, the emissions from manufacturing phase is higher than for electric vehicles than conventional cars, because of the emissions from battery manufacturing and also the emissions from mineral development. But even when we consider the higher emissions from the mineral development, the gap between electric vehicles and conventional vehicles are not that huge. So effectively, the questions about life cycle emissions boils down to the question about the carbon intensity of the electricity to power, to charge the electric vehicles. So with the global average electricity mix, we think the life cycle emissions of electric vehicles have those of conventional cars, with the additional potential to reduce this by further 25% when using cleaner electricity. So tackling the emissions from mineral development are very much crucial and important, but at the same time, they don't negate the climate advantage of clean energy technologies. Next, please. And the word about recycling, the role of recycling. And we think there's some major role for recycling to play in reducing the primary supply burden for minerals. And today, the system for recycling are well established in some of the bulk materials such as copper, aluminum, steel, but this is not yet the case for many of the energy transition minerals such as lithium and rare earth element. And this will have to change because we are expecting a surge in the amount of spent EV batteries, solar panels, wind turbines from around the 2030s. So if not addressed, this burgeoning the spent volumes will add a pressure to manage waste. But if well managed, these volumes can provide valuable sources of mineral supply. So we estimate the minerals from the spent EV batteries can reduce the primary supply burden by around 10% by 2040 in our climate-driven scenario. And in the next slide, in the report, we propose some 6 key areas of actions for policymakers and industry to ensure reliable and sustainable supply of minerals. And my colleague Casey will go through this in more detail in the following slide with more focus on the environmental and social aspect. Over to you, Casey.
Thank you, Tae-yoon. And as just mentioned, our critical minerals report lays out a 6-point plan of action that really outlines a new comprehensive approach to mineral security, which involves many aspects of critical mineral supply. The first point is about that measures to support adequate investment in diversified sources of supply. As mentioned before, early and clear signals from policymakers will be critical to give companies the confidence that they need to commit to new supply. But as everyone familiar with energy security already knows, security of supply also lies in diversity of supply. In this context, resource-owning governments can support new project development by reinforcing national geological surveys, streamlining permitting procedures, and providing financial support to de-risk projects while raising public awareness of the contribution of these projects in the transformation of the energy security. But one of the key insights from our own long experience of energy security at the IEA is that a comprehensive approach cannot focus solely on supply. It's vital for governments to step up support for technology innovation, which can alleviate strains on supply by reducing mineral intensities and opening up possibilities for substitution of various minerals. Just to give one example, 40 to 50% of the reductions in the use of silver and silicon in solar cells over the past decade have been critical to enabling the spectacular rise that we're seeing in solar PV deployment. Also, as Tae-Yoon just described in the previous slide, a third area that's set to become much more important in the future is recycling. As already noted, a significant investment in expanding recycling will be needed if it is to grow into an important source of supply, potentially as much as 10%. A fourth area encompasses measures to increase the resilience of supply chains and improve market transparency. As we know from our existing emergency response programs, regular market assessments, good and accurate data and timely data, and periodic stress tests can help policymakers identify possible weak points, evaluate potential impacts, and devise necessary responses. Strategic stockpiling can in some places also help countries weather short-term supply disruptions. At the same time, the world also needs to step up its efforts to tackle the environmental and social impacts of mineral development, including the emissions, local pollution, treatment of worker safety, and community welfare. Finally, we need to strengthen international collaboration between producers and consumers. For the next several slides, we'll focus on these last 2 points in a bit more depth. Beginning with the environmental and social concerns. One of the key findings of our report is that there is a very strong link between environment and social and governance concerns and supply security. They really can't be treated as separate. Customers and investors are increasingly calling for responsible and sustainable volumes of supply, as many of you already know. And ultimately, if the environmental and social performance across the board does not rise, it may shrink the pool of supply available to meet demand, which can create further market strains. In addition, poor environmental and social performance can also be a source of supply disruption itself. Production sites can be shut down or disrupted due to disputes over water access, consequences of regulatory actions, or potentially human rights violations. Meanwhile, dam failures at tailing storage facilities can lead to extended shutdowns and large remediation and repair costs, and or worse, criminal and civil liability related to environmental damage can raise the cost of production significantly, with severe reputational and financial implications for various companies. Unfortunately, today's picture is far from promising. 10 to 20% of volumes of critical minerals right now are coming from countries with relatively high emissions intensity and relatively low governance scores, according to World Bank indicators. As you can see here, this is particularly high for nickel, and there's also a significant volume coming from areas that have low governance scores for cobalt in particular. Now, to unpack a little bit what we're talking about when we say environmental and social impacts, there are really many, many different types of these impacts, and performance varies significantly between different countries, different metals, different resources, and different producers. This includes, of course, the climate change impacts from the emissions from production, scope 1 and 2. Also impacts from land use and changes in land use, as this can have major adverse impacts on biodiversity as well as communities. There are major risks in terms of water management, as of course, mineral processing for certain types of operations requires very large volumes of water. Of course, there's risks on the waste side, particularly as ore quality declines over time, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then also in terms of governance and health and safety and human rights, particularly in the context of artisanal and small-scale mining, which I'll also return to briefly. So, regarding waste, as we've seen, mineral development is over time generating increasing volumes of waste. And this is for several reasons, but really what we're seeing is as ore grades decline, and at the same time that production figures increase, mining waste volumes are increasing and really increasing to new heights. As you can see from these three charts, just from 2010 to 2017, there's been a significant increase in output as well as the intensity. Mine tailings are particularly troublesome as they're often stored in dams, which pose contamination risks for nearby soil and water bodies, and hazard of dam failure. As many of you have heard, in 2019, the collapse of a tailings storage facility in Brumadinho, Brazil, led to mining waste surging across the surrounding areas and the death of over 200 people. At the same time, sustainable waste development can ensure that instead of causing environmental harm, mining residues are used as resources to support economic development. Waste management policies can promote recycling, can promote the use of mine waste by other sectors, such as cement, and technologies that reduce waste generation, such as dewatering techniques. The industry can also contribute by itself by establishing benchmarks, such as various existing benchmarks, including the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management. On the social impact side, we've found that that artisanal and small-scale mining poses a number of special challenges for countries where this is prevalent. For energy transition metals, this is most relevant in the context of cobalt production, where 10 to 20% of cobalt production in the DRC comes from ASM by some estimates, and other estimates that number is even higher. In this context, their special challenges exist because regulatory protections at ASM sites are often ineffective or non-existent. In many cases, ASM sites are carried on outside of the legal framework without specific regulatory protections in place. This can lead to unsafe working conditions for workers, lack of personal protective equipment, and of course, inadequate safeguards against human rights issues, and including the child labor and the worst forms of child labor. On the more positive side, efforts to formalize ASM activities may improve conditions for workers and reduce these human rights concerns, particularly for child labor. And there have been some promising examples in the DRC of formalized or model mine sites for cobalt. Now, despite these promising results, the long-term viability of this model really remains unclear at this point. Just last year, some of the existing model mine sites in DRC closed down due to COVID-related concerns, and there's been major changes in policy in the past 6 months regarding ASM mining in DRC, and we'll need to wait until that to see as that unfolds what that means for the situation. But what is still very clear is that a stronger commitment to formalization is really needed, not just from governments, but also from the industry, as many of the efforts so far have been led by traders and by purchasers and mining companies themselves. And finally, to return to the sixth point of our energy security framework on international and regional coordination. Now, of course, international coordination already plays a very important role in encouraging companies to identify and address risks across their entire supply chains. In this context, we're talking about the OECD's due diligence guidelines and due diligence guidance, which, although initially established for conflict minerals and high-risk areas related to conflict, applies to other environmental social impacts as well, and across all metals and minerals. And this is really a key success story in our view, although there obviously remains a fair amount of work to scale up these guidance, the use of these guidance. Multilateral efforts can also be necessary and can be particularly effective for enhancing capacity building and knowledge sharing and trying to address some of the key resource gaps between different countries. In this regard, IGF is really an excellent example, but in addition, we've noted the ERGI, an initiative by the US State Department, as well as the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and of course, many, many others. Now, despite these many success stories, the proliferation of international initiatives does increase the risk of duplication and inconsistency, and generally implications from a lack of coordination. And what we've found is that a high-level forum for coordination could play an important role in standardizing environmental and social standards across different countries and across different initiatives, while also improving and ensuring the security of supply. And with that, I think we will turn over to our Q&A. And as we do that, we have one final Menti question for you all, perhaps that you can start answering as we set up for the Q&A portion of the session. So the question for you all is, leading on this final point, what areas in your view what are the areas that are the most important and where international cooperation and coordination is most needed? We've listed as some examples, potentially technology R&D, regulatory policy, due diligence, but this is an open-ended question, and through the Menti platform, you can select and provide your input as well. So we're very interested to see that. And maybe I'll turn it back over to Alec as we watch the results come in.
Thanks so much, Casey, and thanks to both you and Tayoun for the great presentation and great overview of which, again, I encourage everyone to pick it up. Is a really great report and a great overview of some of the challenges and opportunities that are associated with this increasingly rapid and accelerating energy transition that we're witnessing. We have time now for, excuse me, about 20 minutes worth of question and answers. I'm going to open up the panel a little bit and welcome a few other colleagues from the IEA. So if I could ask Thomas Predariol, as well as Rebecca Schultz and Jeremy Lagelet to turn on their cameras and their microphones. They've worked very hard on this report as well. We can't give Casey and Tayoun all the credit, and they'll be available to answer any questions. I see that we have a few that have come through already, but maybe just to kick things off, I will ask. Maybe I'll call on you, Rebecca, if that's okay. Tayoun had mentioned the mismatch between demand and supply, with demand kind of outrunning supply over time, and the crucial role that recycling could play in this. So I was wondering if you could provide us with some insights on what you see as being necessary for recycling to reach the scale that you describe in the report, and what governments might be able to do to incentivize and expand upon recycling programs. There's a clear need for this to happen, but what can governments do, in your opinion?
Thanks, Alec. I think it's a great question, especially looking at the results from the Menti poll. It shows that there's some energy and interest in that as well in the audience. So to help answer your question, perhaps in several parts, I'll start with first, we believe that governments will need to understand better the overall supply and market for recycled minerals. Stock assessments are in place for some minerals, such as copper, but are not widely described regionally or globally for others. Also, end-of-life recycling schemes require several elements, including product design for recycling, so really keeping the end in mind, physical collection and separation, market stimulation, and other incentivizing recycling technologies. These elements together really may necessitate cross-border cooperation and collaboration to help ensure that the market for recycling and the economics really are going to start to work. Additionally, metal-specific policies, including minimum recycled content requirements, tradable recyclable credits, virgin material taxes, all have potential to really help to incentivize recycling and to expand the secondary markets. Alternatively, governments can consider direct subsidies for recycling, or a surcharge, for example, that offsets the cost of recycling, as is the case with California's covered electronic waste program. And so there are really several elements that come into play, but all of that needs to be looked at quite in advance to really plan for recycling that may be coming 20, 30, 40 years down the line.
And I'm going to follow that up with another question before getting to some of the comments that we have in the Q&A. What do you see as the major challenges? Is it just come down to economics at this stage? The major challenges to scaling up recycling when it comes to these critical minerals? I'll let you answer, and maybe Jeremy, you can jump in as well from your perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, yeah, I'll take the first part, and then I'm going to hand that over to Jeremy. As I was just saying, the longer term planning for end of life requirements are really needed to help ensure that the products that are currently entering the market today are ready to be recycled, coming back in 20, 30, or 40 years down the line. And then for consumer, especially, we're coming into a lot more innovation for consumer products and clean energy infrastructure, and that's driving enhanced functionality, and that comes with an increasingly complex interaction of an integration of metals and materials, and those together present physical, chemical, and thermodynamic challenges that I'm sure the audience here can appreciate. And those really require innovation and also investment to help to solve. And Jeremy's been doing quite a bit of research on battery policies, and especially EV battery policies and recycling. So I'll hand it over to Jeremy to touch on that, because it's quite a hot topic.
Thanks a lot, Becky. So as mentioned, on the policy side of things, a comprehensive approach is necessary to tackle the most multifaceted challenges of batteries, especially when it comes to incentivizing recycling. So to mention an example of such an approach, the EU recently published a proposed sustainable batteries regulation, which aims to enhance separate collection of portable batteries to achieve 70% collection by 2030, up from less than 50% in 2018, and also prohibit any landfilling. The regulation also sets out minimum levels of recycled content and material recovery, which will gradually increase over time. So policies such as this one, this is one of several policies, can really help in terms of developing a comprehensive approach that is key to achieving both a circular economy while also ensuring clean mobility and high penetration of renewables.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I'm going to go to the Q&A at the moment. And Alejandro Gonzalez, thanks for joining us and thanks for your contributions here. I'm going to try to kind of capture them quickly because there's a lot here, but essentially I think it boils down to SDG 12 on responsible consumption and production. Were you able to kind of bring this into the report in any way, this basic idea that fundamentally there's a need for us to reduce the amount of raw materials and inputs that are going into our general lifestyles overall, including energy? Was this brought into the report in any way?
Maybe I can take that question.
Sure, Taeyoon, thanks.
Yep. So our projections about mineral requirement depends on based on our annual projection about energy technology and supply in the World Energy Outlooks. And in the World Energy Outlook scenario, we also take into account the impact of these behavioral changes and also the material efficiency improvement. So for example, the people switching to more public transport, and maybe in the plane, they take less business travels, and all these kind of behavioral change measures are already reflected in the sustainable development scenario. And we also assumes much higher efficiency improvement, which reduce the role of the energy demand growth in that scenario. Although we take some conservative approach to take into account the impact of the behavioral changes, because we cannot be very optimistic about the impact of these behavioral changes on the energy demand growth. But so these kind of behavioral changes and material efficiencies in part reflected in our sustainable development scenario. And in terms of minerals, and we think there are some role for supply and technology innovation and recycling all play a role to address the challenges. And on the technology innovation side, there are some three aspects, which is one is the technology innovation to reduce the material intensity. For example, solar PV, and we have seen some 50% reduction in the intensity of silver use and silicon use over the past decade, which enabled some strong growth of solar panels. And this kind of the effort to reduce material intensity and also enable some substitution between materials. For example, in the grid networks, there are some potential to switch from copper to aluminum in underground cables if the situation allows. And so this kind of technological potential is also need to be tapped. And we, in our report, we also built some 11 alternative technology cases where we tried to quantify the impact of these alternative technology evolution cases and how much they could reduce the overall mineral requirement. So these are also some part reflected in our full report.
Thanks, Taeyoon. I like that. I like your comment on we cannot be optimistic about behavioral change. I hope you're wrong, but I understand your pessimism there. I'm going to ask a question to Tomasz. We have, Taeyoon covered in his presentation the carbon footprint of some of this minerals development and the fact that really you can't compare it to traditional energy sources in terms of its impact. It's far less, but there is still a need to reduce that impact. What are some of the most promising opportunities to reduce carbon footprints when it comes to the minerals development that we're speaking of today? And I have kind of a sub question from Ladiu Amir, who is asking, to what extent in the era of climate change can you justify the localization or regionalization of green technology supply chains as a way of building resilience, spreading benefits, but also reducing the environmental costs associated with shipping energy? So any thoughts on that, Tomasz?
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in on that. So indeed, the emissions intensity of production varies a lot across companies and regions, and that depends on three main topics: operational practices. So for example, what is the transporting system that's being used? power sources, and production pathways, including what are the type of resources that are being produced. And strategies to reduce energy-related emissions from mining include increasing the share of low carbon electricity, acting on energy efficiency, and switching to cleaner fuels. Now, emissions from electricity can be reduced by using low carbon electricity via corporate power purchase agreements. We've been seeing this increasing a lot, or on-site renewable generation efforts. It's also something we've seen in several mines, the use of wind power, solar power, and so on and so forth. Whereas energy efficiency can come from optimizing production pathways and technological improvements. And I think this ties into the question that was in the chat about the regionalization of supply chains and the amount of energy that goes into transport and shipping. So certainly that is a way to reduce the carbon footprint of emissions and something that could make a difference going forward. And lastly, on reducing emissions from fuels, it's very important to mention diesel use in trucks. That's a very important element of tackling fossil fuel consumption. And this can be achieved either by incorporating cleaner fuels or by electrifying transport processes. So I think those are some of the main elements of this discussion.
Great, thanks, Tomas. I think it's really exciting to see how quickly some of those new technologies are being adopted by the sector, whether it's the use of electric vehicles in deep mines, reducing the need for refrigeration and ventilation and other very, very high energy use costs for a mine. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'll ask maybe about international coordination. A lot of the IGF's members are producer countries when it comes to these minerals. What do you think, maybe this is a question for you, Jeremy, to start with, but what do you think can be done to improve coordination between producer and consumer countries when it comes to these critical minerals?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Alec. So first, our report recognizes that international coordination has led to encouraging success stories, including the global adoption and implementation of the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and also continued improvements of transparency standards, for example, through the EITI. So as Casey mentioned, though, uncoordinated efforts can lead to potential duplications or gaps. So we see several ways through which this coordination can be improved. The first way would be to ramp up capacity building and knowledge transfer, as experience and capacity varies greatly between countries. And this can be done and built on successful efforts by IGF, by ERGI, or the World Bank. And second, as mentioned, a high-level forum for international coordination, as well as an international governance framework for minerals, which is still lacking, could be key in standardizing environmental and social standards and coordinating activity on security of supply. So this is really key to ensuring that coordination is not perceived as a zero-sum game and covers all points of the value chain. So not simply focusing on the consumer or the producer perspective.
Thanks. Tomas, anything to add to that, or Rebecca?
Yeah, sure. So I think that this is something that we have highlighted a lot in our presentations. There are multiple avenues where, and this ties back to the last question, also on the regionalization of supply chains. So there are many ways in which governments can cooperate. And there's really a need to focus on governance issues and coordinate the different strategies between countries so that we don't get to the point where we either are low on the supply or the demand of minerals, and that we don't have the proper environmental sustainability and governance around those topics.
And just to add briefly, because I think Jeremy and Tomas have covered it extremely well, is I think it just plays into the continued conversation and the evolution of energy security and how different countries and governments may need to consider and change some of the aspects that we have historically with regards to sharing information and especially on critical stock data and information flows.
Thanks so much. And yeah, just to reiterate the fact that at the IGF, we're very happy to play some small role in this kind of coordination and partnership that we're developing with the team at IEA. We have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to ask about next steps. And maybe I'll pass the floor back to Casey and Taeyoon. Given the minerals are a new area for EIA, Can you tell us a bit about where you're planning to go beyond this report and what are some potential areas for future analysis? Where are you thinking of taking this work beyond the very good report that you've just released?
We have a long-term modeling tools that project energy demand and supply over the next decade in our usual World Energy Outlook publications. But until now, the minerals and metals were not in the regular part of this modeling tools. So the first immediate plan is to incorporate the minerals and metals component in our long-term energy modeling tools, so that we can make the minerals and metals interact with our energy modeling exercise. So that is our first aim. And then we also plan to expand our analysis to incorporate more minerals. So for example, there's some question about aluminum, so we could not cover in the scope of this report, but we plan to expand to the wider set of minerals that are critical for clean energy technologies. And also, there are some other sectors we could not cover. For example, CCUS is very much essential to achieve our global climate goals, but we could not cover that in the report. So we plan to expand to a wider set of minerals and technologies in the future effort.
Thinking a bit about the next steps on the kind of coordination and on the general energy security approach, just to say that this is really meant, this report, as a first step. As I noted at the beginning of the presentation, our members gave us and asked us to go forward and look into this issue. And really, we have identified some steps that can be taken on energy security. And really our next step will be to take this back to our member governments and really see what direction they would like us to take this in, given that the IEA already has certain energy security mechanisms, whether there is a need to create parallel versions of this or to incorporate it into existing ones, whether that's at the IEA or elsewhere, it's really a question for the governments. But one thing that's coming out very clearly in what we're understanding from all stakeholders involved is that nobody wants to reinvent the wheel and nobody wants to duplicate existing mechanisms, and really a very clear outcome and very clear direction from every side is that there will be a need for further collaboration and coordination to make sure that we take advantage of the expertise and the existing great work that's being done by organizations like IGF, OECD, and many others. So that's just to say that wherever we end up going with the next stages of this, we will be looking to partner with a number of different organizations to make sure that we take advantage of the different strengths and different stakeholders and different agendas and try to keep that as closely coordinated as we can. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all the panelists. I think that this has been a great discussion from my perspective. I think the fact that you've started to look at this really is reflective of the fact that there is a fundamental shift underway when it comes to the way that we produce energy. And it's a necessary shift, as we all know. From our members, I think we're hearing similar things to what you're hearing. There's excitement about the shift. There's also trepidation, I guess not trepidation, but just a need to get it right. And there's an understanding from governments that they're going to play a crucial role in that transition and in making sure that it happens in a way that is environmentally and socially responsible, as well as really pushing us toward a low carbon future. So to all our attendees, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the IEA again for the collaboration. I encourage you all to read the report. We will be sending it out along with a recording of the webinar and any slides that we used, but watch this space. I think that this is not the last that we will hear on this, and I look forward to what comes next from the IEA. Just to note that we'll be touching upon climate issues and critical mineral issues at the IGF's annual general meeting in October. So I look forward to seeing you then, but we'll probably see you before that as well. So thanks again to everyone, and take care of yourselves.